I woke up that morning to the sound of my neighbor's voice, shrill and deliberate, like she was narrating her every move to an invisible audience. At first, I thought she was just yelling at her poodle again, but then came the loud snip followed by a sudden silence inside my house. My Wi-Fi router lights went dark all at once, like someone had flipped a switch on my entire digital life. Netflix cut off mid-episode, my work VPN disconnected, and the smart thermostat froze at an awkward 81 degrees. That's when I realized, Karen had actually done it. She'd cut my cable. It would have been funny if it weren't so absurd. Who does that in 2025? Who physically crawls into someone else's yard with a pair of garden shears to sabotage the internet like it's the main power supply in a spy movie? But of course this was Karen. The self-appointed HOA enforcer, the woman who once wrote me up for having unsanctioned wind chimes. She believed she had divine jurisdiction over the cul-de-sac, and I guess my Wi-Fi was her latest battlefield. The thing is, what she didn't know, what made this whole disaster delicious, was that 2 weeks earlier, I had installed motion-activated security cameras. Not the cheap battery ones either. Full 4K, night vision capable, wide-angle coverage of the side yard where the cable box sat. I had caught raccoons, stray cats, and even a drunk teenager trying to shortcut through my fence line. And now, thanks to Karen, I had footage of a middle-aged woman in designer sandals crouching in my mulch bed with a pair of fiskars like she was about to harvest corn. I didn't rush outside to confront her. That would have ruined it. No, I sat back down with my coffee, let the router reboot in despair, and thought about how to play this long game. Karen thrived on immediate drama, screaming matches, and threats of reporting this to the HOA. I thrived on patience, timing, and the kind of setups that made her look ridiculous in her own theater. By noon, she'd already bragged to 2 neighbors about how she had handled my supposed Wi-Fi tower. As if my internet service was a giant antenna poisoning the community instead of a plain white fiber line buried underground. One of those neighbors, bless his soul, casually mentioned it to me while I was checking my mailbox, testing the waters like he wasn't sure if I'd explode. I just smiled and said, "That's interesting. I'll take a look at it tonight." Calm. Flat. No reaction. Karen thrives on fireworks. Silence unsettles her more. That night, after the sun dropped and the streetlights hummed on, I reviewed the footage. There she was, bold as daylight, snipping the line with the precision of someone cutting wrapping paper. I slowed it down, zoomed in, captured her face frozen in that exact Karen grimace that screams both satisfaction and insecurity. I had digital gold. And the best part? She didn't even glance around. No hesitation. She was so sure of herself that she committed vandalism like she was watering her lawn. I thought about dropping the footage straight to the HOA board. But I knew better. Half of them were her wine-night buddies, and all I'd get would be another letter about inappropriate surveillance equipment, or some nonsense. No, this had to escalate in stages. I wanted her trapped by her own arrogance, with every neighbor watching. The next morning, she strutted past my driveway with her dog, pausing just long enough to sneer at my dark cable box like she had personally won a neighborhood war. I gave her the friendliest wave I could muster, the kind of wave that says I know something you don't. That small flicker of doubt in her eyes, that was my opening move. By the weekend, I had my plan in motion. I scheduled a service call with my ISP, but not for the repair. The cable was already spliced back together. I'd handled that myself with a quick trip to Home Depot. What I scheduled was a technician visit, during peak Saturday morning dog walking hours. A white van with the company logo parked right in front of my house, hazard lights blinking, a guy in uniform walking around inspecting the side yard. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, dogs barked at the stranger, and Karen hovered 2 houses down pretending to water her flowers while craning her neck. The technician wasn't even there for 5 minutes before I joined him, making a show of pointing at the cable box, shaking my head, and then glancing deliberately in Karen's direction. She froze, hose dangling, and I swear I could hear her dog's tags clinking from how hard she yanked the leash to retreat. That night, I uploaded a still frame from the footage to a private folder, labeled neatly in case I needed to present it to law enforcement later. Because as satisfying as this little theater was, I knew Karen wasn't finished. Cutting the cable wasn't her endgame. It was just the beginning of her newest crusade, and judging from her past antics, the next act would be louder, dumber, and infinitely more entertaining. And I was ready for it. Karen did not take long to escalate. If there is one thing predictable about her, it's that she can't leave well enough alone. By Monday morning, I was sitting at my desk, working remotely as usual, when I caught sight of her out the window. She was in her element, clipboard in hand, phone pressed to her ear, striding across the cul-de-sac like a general inspecting her troop. Every time she looked in my direction, her lips curled with smugness. I knew that meant she had filed something official. Sure enough, by lunchtime I received an email from the HOA board. Subject line: Urgent, non-compliance violation. I could practically hear Karen's voice in the phrasing, because only she would use words like unsanctioned telecommunications equipment. The notice accused me of running an illegal Wi-Fi tower that supposedly interfered with the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. Never mind that my internet cable was underground and invisible. Never mind that every house in the subdivision had some version of the same service. Karen had spun a tale convincing enough that the board agreed to investigate. I almost laughed. But I didn't reply to the email. I never reply when I can bait. Instead, I waited. And as expected, that evening around 6:30, a pair of board members knocked on my door. One was Jeff, the HOA president who only took the role because no one else wanted it, and the other was Linda, who treated bylaws like scripture. They stood stiffly in my driveway, pretending they were on official duty, when really they were just doing Karen's bidding. Jeff cleared his throat. "We've had reports of unusual equipment on your property." I smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "Equipment? Like what?" Linda chimed in, flipping through her papers. "A Wi-Fi tower, apparently." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "A tower? You think I built a tower?" They shifted uncomfortably, probably realizing how ridiculous the accusation sounded out loud. I invited them into the yard to inspect. Of course, they found nothing but my utility box, identical to everyone else's. Linda looked perplexed. Jeff sighed, clearly regretting his role in this circus. And then Karen appeared, like clockwork, striding over with her dog and that triumphant smirk. "There. Right there," she barked, pointing at the box. "That's it. That's the tower that's been blasting signals across the neighborhood." Jeff squinted at it. "Karen, that's the same box you have on your house." She waved him off. "No, his is different. It's stronger. I've seen the lights blinking at night." I couldn't resist. "Lights blinking? You mean the security camera I installed? The one pointed at this exact spot?" Her face twitched, but she covered it quickly. "Cameras aren't allowed without HOA approval." Linda perked up at that, flipping through her notes like she'd just discovered a loophole. I let them ramble about possible bylaw violations while Karen fumed, arms crossed, certain she'd finally nailed me. What she didn't realize was that she had just walked into my trap, because I had already prepared a little demonstration. "Since you're here," I said, pulling out my phone, "let me show you why I needed those cameras." I opened the app, tapped on the video feed, and up popped the high-definition footage of Karen crouched beside my cable, snipping away like she was trimming roses. The silence was delicious. Jeff's jaw slackened, Linda gasped, and Karen froze mid-blink. I didn't play the whole thing, just enough to leave no doubt. Then I locked my phone screen and slid it back into my pocket. "This is why," I said calmly. "Someone vandalized my property. I figured cameras were a reasonable precaution." Karen exploded. "That's not me. That's doctored. You probably hired an actress." Jeff pinched the bridge of his nose. Linda muttered something about reviewing the bylaws, clearly trying to retreat. Karen, however, wasn't done. She followed them off my property, shrieking about deepfakes and illegal surveillance, making a bigger fool of herself with every step. The next day, the rumor mill was spinning out of control. By midweek, 3 different neighbors had approached me privately, each one whispering some version of, "Did Karen really cut your Wi-Fi?" Everyone wanted to know, but no one wanted to be caught gossiping openly. I played it cool, neither confirming nor denying, which of course only fueled their curiosity. Karen must have realized the story was slipping out of her control, because her tactics shifted. If she couldn't win by rules or intimidation, she'd try to win by numbers. That Friday evening, as I took out the trash, I spotted her hosting what looked like a strategy session on her porch. 4 of her usual allies sat around with wine glasses, nodding vigorously as she waved papers in the air. She was orchestrating something bigger. The following morning, I learned what it was: a petition. Karen had gone door to door collecting signatures to restrict unauthorized surveillance equipment in the neighborhood. Her argument? That my cameras were an invasion of privacy. Ironically, she didn't mention the Wi-Fi tower nonsense anymore. She pivoted the narrative completely, hoping to erase her mistake. Now, this was the part where I could have panicked. If she got enough signatures, she might have forced the board to vote on a new rule. But instead of fighting it head-on, I let her dig. She wanted to weaponize paranoia against me? Fine. I would show the neighborhood what paranoia really looked like. That night, I adjusted the motion settings on my cameras so they would trigger their floodlights with the faintest movement. Squirrels, leaves, even shadows. The next evening, Karen was walking her dog past my house when the lights flashed on. She jumped, yanking the leash so hard the poor poodle nearly toppled over. She muttered something under her breath and hurried off. But of course, she came back an hour later, determined to prove something. Same result. Lights blazed, camera whirred, and she flinched like she'd been caught. Within 2 days, she was ranting to anyone who would listen about how my cameras were stalking her. Which, naturally, only made her look more unhinged, because everyone else had passed my house dozens of times without incident. The lights didn't bother them. They bothered her. And soon, the narrative flipped. Neighbors started whispering that maybe Karen was up to something, since she was the only one complaining. By the end of the week, she was unraveling. The petition lost steam, the board grew tired of her theatrics, and even her wine night allies began backing away. But Karen doesn't retreat gracefully. She doubles down. And that's exactly what she did next, upping the stakes in a way that made cutting the Wi-Fi cable look like child's play. Because one Saturday morning, just as I was settling into my coffee, I heard the unmistakable sound of hammering coming from my side yard. And when I stepped outside to look, I saw Karen standing there with a hammer and a "no trespassing" sign she was trying to nail to my own fence. This wasn't over. Not even close. I didn't shout. I didn't storm over and grab the hammer from her hand, though every instinct told me to. Karen thrived on explosions, on public scenes where she could cast herself as the victim. No, I stood in my driveway, coffee mug in hand, and watched her like she was an animal caught rooting through my garbage. Calm. Silent. Just present enough to make her squirm. She must have felt it because her hammering slowed. She turned, wide-eyed, caught mid-swing with my fence under her hand. For half a second I thought she might back down. But of course, she doubled down. "This is community property," she barked, pointing the hammer at me like it was a gavel. "I have every right to post this sign." I took a slow sip of coffee. "That's funny," I said. "Last time I checked, this fence was on my property line. Do you usually hammer things into other people's walls, or is today special?" Her face flushed, but she tried to hold her ground. "Your fence faces the street. That makes it shared space. And shared space falls under HOA jurisdiction." "Really?" I asked. "Then why does my property tax bill say otherwise?" Her eyes darted, searching for a comeback, But before she could find one, another sound broke the tension: the slam of a car door. Across the street, my neighbor Greg was pulling into his driveway. Greg was a retired cop, and though he usually kept to himself, he had zero patience for Karen's antics. He took one look at the hammer in her hand and called out, "Karen, what the hell are you doing to his fence?" She stammered, I'm protecting the neighborhood from unauthorized surveillance." Greg chuckled darkly. "By vandalizing his property? That's trespassing." He set his grocery bags down and started toward us. Karen panicked. She yanked the half-fastened sign off the fence, nearly splintering the wood, and muttered something about board approval as she scurried back to her yard. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The damage was done, not to my fence but to her credibility. Greg saw everything, and Greg had friends. Word would travel fast. That night I reviewed the footage. Of course, the cameras had caught her hammering attempt from 3 angles. I clipped the cleanest one, saved it to the same private folder as the cable-cutting video, and labeled it neatly, Incident 2. My evidence folder was becoming a Karen anthology, each clip more absurd than the last. But Karen wasn't going to fade into the background. Oh no. She came back swinging harder than ever. The very next morning, I found a formal letter taped to my door, typed in all caps like a ransom note. It accused me of harassment through illumination, claiming that my camera floodlights were targeting her specifically. She demanded that I remove them immediately or face legal consequences. I almost laughed coffee out of my nose when I read it. Legal consequences, from the woman who had already cut my cable and trespassed with a hammer. Still, I scanned the letter, saved it in my folder, and tucked the original away. Every piece of her paper trail was ammunition for the endgame I was building. 2 days later, she escalated again. This time, it was noise complaints. According to another HOA email, my late-night disturbances were disruptive to community peace. Never mind that I'm in bed by 11, and my idea of a party is letting the dishwasher run overnight. Clearly, Karen had either fabricated the complaints or convinced a neighbor to join her crusade. I decided to lean into it. That evening, I set up a Bluetooth speaker in my backyard. Not blaring music, not obnoxious bass, just a soft loop of crickets and distant thunder. Peaceful, atmospheric, the kind of background noise you'd find on a meditation app. I let it run for an hour after sunset, then shut it off. The next morning, sure enough, I got another HOA notice citing unnatural nocturnal disturbances. I couldn't have scripted it better if I tried. Meanwhile, Karen's paranoia was starting to leak into public view. At the community mailbox cluster, she cornered 2 neighbors and ranted about how my cameras were spying on her every move. One of them, a mild-mannered teacher named Denise, asked the obvious question. Why would his cameras be spying on you if you're not doing anything near his house? Karen's answer was a shriek about digital harassment that made Denise physically recoil. By the time I strolled up to collect my mail, Karen was red-faced and sputtering, while Denise gave me a look that clearly said, "I'm sorry you deal with this woman." The beauty of it was that I never had to raise my voice. I never had to argue. Karen was building her own gallows plank by plank, and I was quietly saving every board. The breaking point came one Thursday evening. I was grilling chicken on my back patio when I heard a commotion out front. Voices, heated and shrill. I peeked around the side gate and saw Karen standing with 2 HOA board members, one of them waving a clipboard. They were at Greg's driveway, of all places. "You can't park that truck here," Karen screeched. "It violates community standards." Greg, calm as ever, leaned against the hood of his pickup. "Karen, this truck is registered, insured, and parked in my own driveway. What law am I breaking?" "It's unsightly," she snapped. "The bylaws say no commercial vehicles." "This isn't commercial. It's personal. Bought it with my pension." The board members looked trapped between them, clearly uncomfortable. Karen jabbed her finger toward my house. "First it was his cameras, now it's your truck. This neighborhood is falling apart because people refuse to follow the rules. Greg's eyes flicked toward me, catching me watching. Then, with a smirk, he said, "Funny, Karen. I've got a camera too. Want to see the footage of you hammering signs into his fence last week?" The color drained from her face. She spun on her heel, muttering something about ungrateful neighbors, and stormed back to her house. The board members trailed behind her, shaking their heads. That night, I knew we had crossed into a new phase. Karen wasn't just targeting me anymore. She was alienating her allies, spreading herself too thin. It was only a matter of time before her obsession imploded. So I decided to give her one last nudge. The following Saturday, I hosted a casual cookout. Nothing fancy, just burgers, hot dogs, a cooler of beer. I invited a handful of neighbors, including Greg and Denise. I didn't advertise it as anything more than a friendly gathering, but I set one chair in the center of the yard facing the patio screen. And when everyone had a plate in hand, I queued up the footage. First, the cable cutting. Then the hammering incident. Each clip played in crisp detail, Karen's face unmistakable. The crowd laughed, groaned, shook their heads. No one defended her. Not even her former wine night allies, who sat pale and quiet in the corner. I didn't say much. I didn't have to. The footage spoke louder than any speech I could have given. By the end of the night, the consensus was clear. Karen had gone too far. What I didn't realize was that she wasn't going to take this humiliation lying down. Because the very next morning, at 6 a.m., I woke to the sound of sirens in the distance. And when I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, I saw flashing red and blue lights parked right in front of my house. Karen had called the cops on me. The knock on my door was sharp and authoritative, the kind that makes you instinctively straighten your posture even if you've done nothing wrong. I opened it to find two officers standing there, hands resting lightly on their belts, cruiser lights still pulsing against the curb. Behind them, I could see Karen on her lawn, robe cinched tight, hair wild, gesturing with both hands as if conducting an orchestra of outrage. "Morning," one officer said, his voice neutral but edged with fatigue. "We got a call about some sort of disturbance here." I raised an eyebrow. "At 6 in the morning?" The officer flipped open his notepad. "The complainant said you've been harassing her with surveillance equipment, shining lights into her property, and recording her without permission." I didn't look over at Karen, though I could feel her glare burning into the side of my head. Instead, I let out a slow breath and said, "Of course she did. Come on in. I'll show you exactly what's going on." Inside, I led them straight to my desk and pulled up the live camera feed. I toggled through the different angles, front yard, side yard, backyard, all facing my property lines, all legal, all boringly ordinary. "These are security cameras," I explained, "installed after repeated vandalism. They don't face her house. They don't peer into her windows. They monitor my property, period." The older officer nodded. The younger one glanced at the footage, then at me, clearly unimpressed by Karen's story. "Still, procedure is procedure. Do you have proof of the vandalism?" That was my cue. I opened the folder labeled neatly on my desktop, Evidence. One by one, I played the clips. Karen cutting my Wi-Fi cable, Karen hammering the sign into my fence. Both officers leaned closer, silent, their faces betraying nothing until the hammer clip finished and the younger one let out a low whistle. "That's her?" he asked. "That's her," I said. "Caught in the act twice. And just so we're clear, I haven't pressed charges yet. I was hoping the HOA would deal with it internally. But since she decided to escalate, I let the implication hang in the air." The older officer shut his notepad. "All right. From what we see here, you're within your rights. These cameras are legal. And what she did to your property is not." They thanked me for my time, then stepped back outside. I didn't follow them out, but through the blinds I caught the aftermath. Karen stormed toward them, shouting about her constitutional rights, waving her arms like she was swatting invisible bees. The officers let her rant for about 30 seconds before the older one raised a hand, firm but calm, and she froze. He said something I couldn't hear. Then she deflated, shoulders slumped, and retreated back to her house with her dog dragging reluctantly behind her. For the first time in weeks, I felt the balance shift. The police weren't on her side. They'd seen the footage, seen the truth. And word would spread fast in a neighborhood where people peek through blinds at the faintest sound of drama. But I also knew Karen wouldn't stop here. She couldn't. Her identity was wrapped around being the enforcer, the moral authority, the one who protected the neighborhood. Losing ground meant losing face, and losing face was unacceptable to her. She'd either escalate or implode. And judging by the fury on her face as the cops drove away, I knew which one it would be. That evening, I caught her prowling again. Not near my house this time. She wasn't dumb enough to test the cameras so soon, but across the street, whispering to one of her remaining allies. Papers in hand, voice sharp, gestures wild. Recruiting, plotting, trying to salvage the narrative. The ally nodded along, but the stiff body language gave her away. People were starting to fear association with Karen. 2 days later, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. Not unusual, our neighborhood drama often earned special sessions. But this one had an edge. Flyers went out. The subject line on the email was blunt. Neighborhood concerns regarding surveillance and property disputes. I could practically hear Karen dictating it to Linda over speakerphone. I decided to attend. Not to defend myself. My evidence already spoke louder than words, but to watch. To let the stage lights burn Karen while I sat in the audience, cool as ever. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige room with folding chairs and bad fluorescent lighting. By the time I arrived, the place was packed. Retirees in polos, young couples with toddlers, even Greg sitting in the back with his arms crossed like a bouncer at a club. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that only HOA drama can summon. Karen stood at the front, clipboard clutched like a weapon, papers stacked in uneven piles. Her eyes darted nervously until she spotted me slipping into a chair near the middle. She straightened, smirked, and launched into her speech. She painted herself as the neighborhood's savior, claimed my cameras were targeting her, that the floodlights had blinded her during dog walks, that she lived under constant fear of being watched. She brandished her petition, which I noticed had far fewer signatures than she'd bragged about earlier. Every sentence dripped with exaggeration, and every time she tried to rally the room, people shifted uncomfortably in their seat. When she finally paused, Jeff, our reluctant HOA president, cleared his throat. "Does the accused homeowner wish to respond?" I stood slowly, taking my time, letting the silence stretch. Then I said, "Yes. But I'd rather show you than tell you." I pulled my tablet from my bag, already queued to the video folder. With a simple tap, the footage rolled on the projector screen at the front of the room. Karen cutting my cable. Karen hammering the sign. Crystal clear, time-stamped, irrefutable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone actually laughed. Karen shot to her feet. "This is doctored. He's framing me." I raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying I hired an actress who looks exactly like you, dressed exactly like you, and wanders into my yard at exactly the times you were missing from your own?" No one laughed this time. They just stared at her. Greg chimed in from the back. "I saw her with the hammer myself." "He's not lying." Karen sputtered, red-faced, turning to her remaining allies for backup. But they stared down at their laps, suddenly very interested in their shoelaces. The silence was suffocating. Finally, Jeff rubbed his temples. "Karen, we've given you a lot of leeway over the years. But this? This is beyond the pale." Linda, her once loyal sidekick, reluctantly nodded. "It's hard to ignore video evidence." Karen's voice cracked. "You're all against me. This whole neighborhood has turned toxic. You'll regret siding with him." She pointed at me with a trembling hand, then stormed out, papers scattering in her wake like confetti at the worst parade ever thrown. The room exhaled as one. Neighbors began murmuring, relief mingling with amusement. Jeff announced the board would review the evidence, but that no action would be taken against me. In fact, he added diplomatically, it seems security cameras might be advisable, given recent events. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Karen had self-destructed in front of the very people whose approval she craved. But if I thought that was the end, I was wrong. Because that night, around midnight, as I sat winding down with a book, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the feed and froze. The motion alert didn't lie. On my phone screen, the grainy black and white night vision showed Karen hunched along my fence line, hood pulled over her frizzed hair, clutching something metallic that caught the light every time she shifted. At first I thought it was another hammer, but as she moved closer to the utility box, I realized it was worse. She had brought bolt cutters. For a split second, I debated storming outside to stop her. But that was exactly what she wanted. Another confrontation where she could twist the narrative into violent neighbor harasses woman. No, I had a better idea. I set the phone on the table, opened my laptop, and queued up the recording software linked to the cameras. Every move she made was being documented in 4K, audio and all. Karen knelt at the box, struggling with the latch, muttering under her breath. The mic picked up her words faintly. He thinks he can humiliate me. I'll show him. I'll shut him down for good. Her voice cracked with desperation, the kind that comes when someone realizes their kingdom is slipping through their fingers. I dialed 911, calm and measured, just like the long game demanded. Yes, I'd like to report an attempted act of vandalism in progress at my address. I have video evidence of the suspect on my property right now. The dispatcher assured me units were on their way. Out the window, I saw her silhouette jerk as my floodlights triggered. She froze, deer in headlights, then scrambled to her feet. The cutters clattered against the pavement. She bolted down the side of the house, but the cameras tracked her every step. 3 minutes later, the cruisers rolled in. Sirens cut, lights blazing. Karen hadn't even made it back inside when the officers intercepted her at the edge of her driveway. I watched from my porch, mug of coffee in hand like it was any other night, as they questioned her. Her excuses poured out fast, each one less convincing than the last. I was just checking for safety hazards. He's been harassing me. That's not my tool, I was carrying it for a friend. The officers listened patiently, then turned to me. I showed them the live footage, then rewound it to her crouching at the box, bolt cutters in hand, whispering threats. That was all it took. They placed her in handcuff. For a moment, she went limp, stunned, as though the reality had finally hit her. Then the tantrum exploded. She shrieked about conspiracies, about the HOA, about her rights. She tried to twist away, but the officers remained calm, guiding her toward the cruiser as her voice echoed down the cul-de-sac. Curtains twitched. Neighbors peeked. The queen of the HOA, dragged away under flashing red and blue lights. It was surreal to witness. Not triumphant, not even satisfying in the way I'd imagined, just surreal. After months of power plays, intimidation, and sabotage, the unraveling had finally reached its inevitable end. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. People lingered longer at their mailboxes, trading whispers about the arrest. Someone had filmed the cruiser driving off, and by noon it had circulated through the neighborhood Facebook group. The comments were brutal. Jokes about Karen's, HOA dictatorship, memes of bolt cutters, even sympathy posts that still somehow condemned her behavior. Greg stopped by that afternoon, arms folded, smirk plastered across his face. "Heard you finally took the crown off her head," he said. I shook my head. She took it off herself. I just gave her the stage. That night, I sat on my porch with a quiet sense of closure. But it wasn't over yet. Karen had been released pending charges, and the HOA still had to convene. When they did, the board was decisive for once. Jeff announced that Karen was suspended indefinitely from all board duties, pending legal resolution. Linda resigned shortly after, citing stress. For the first time in years, The HOA was effectively free from Karen's grip. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. People who had once avoided eye contact now waved from their lawns. Small talk returned. A kid set up a lemonade stand without anyone reporting it. Someone else hung wind chimes, and no letter arrived demanding removal. The cul-de-sac exhaled. As for Karen, her house grew quieter. The blinds stayed shut, the lawn went unkempt, the once busy porch sat empty. Occasionally I'd see her slip out late at night, hood up, dog dragging along like it wanted to be anywhere else. But the fire was gone from her stride. She wasn't the queen anymore. She was just another neighbor, diminished, nursing her own downfall. Weeks later, I was called to testify at a preliminary hearing. The judge reviewed the footage, unimpressed by her claims of digital manipulation. My testimony was short, clear, professional. Karen's lawyer tried to spin her actions as misunderstood neighborhood maintenance, but the video spoke louder. The case moved forward. When I left the courthouse, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt done. Done playing her games, done waiting for the next ambush. My cameras still stood, vigilant as ever, but for the first time in months, they weren't catching chaos. Just squirrels, delivery drivers, the occasional wandering raccoon. Normal life. One evening, Greg joined me for a beer on the porch. He raised his bottle in a mock toast. "You realize you didn't just win. You might have retired her." I chuckled. "Retired? She'll find some new crusade eventually. Just not here." And he was right. Because a month later, a for sale sign appeared in Karen's yard. No announcement, no farewell, just the silent surrender of someone who had lost her kingdom and couldn't bear to live in the ruins. The day the moving truck came, neighbors watched discreetly from their windows, not out of malice but out of sheer disbelief. The woman who once ruled the cul-de-sac with clipboards and citations was now packing her life into cardboard boxes. I didn't gloat, didn't wave. I just sat quietly, letting the moment pass. When the truck finally pulled away, a strange peace settled over the street. It wasn't just her absence. It was the absence of fear, of tension, of always waiting for the next ridiculous battle. The HOA began discussing practical things again. Landscaping, security lighting, maybe even a block party. Real community without tyranny. And me? I kept my cameras, not out of paranoia but as a reminder. A reminder that patience, timing, and calm strategy beat chaos every time. A reminder that some battles are won not by shouting the loudest, but by letting the other side unravel in their own noise. Karen thought she could cut my Wi-Fi and silence me. What she really cut was her own rope, and I just held the camera steady while she did it.